Jana, following on from what Dmitry is saying, and to my earlier question, how do you think people in Russia see this idea of Western hands at work in this way? Speaking from here in London, it could seem a bit like a Cold War anachronism.
Yeah, it's the usual short link that they like to use. I mean, it's not only about referring to Ukraine, it's about referring to what has followed after the Orange Revolution, which was always presented in Russia as chaos. And the short link basically is, if you're supporting these people, they're not organized, and what you're going to see is more chaos. And I think that was the message he was trying to get out. In terms of the US meddling into the whole thing and also the Western involvement, I don't really think it's the sort of, any message towards the West. It was really domestically oriented. It's just that the West is such a convenient opponent in terms of, you can attack him as long as you can attack the West as much as you want, but they're not going to really strike back.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. We're hosting a debate in our London studios about Putin's televised phone-in with the Russian public. I'm joined by Jana Kobzova, a fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations, Asha Pirt, an elections expert, and over the phone from Moscow by the political analyst Dmitry Andreev. We were talking, Asha, about this East versus West dynamic. Putin made some barbs about John McCain. He had a spat with Hillary Clinton over the elections. And on television, he said, they still fear our nuclear potential. Does that kind of thing play well with the home crowd?
It does in some sections of Russian society. But again, it's a classic still going on that we're high in the GDP level, we're still high in the economic level, we're still high we've got as many nuclear weapons as the US has got. Those constant, these kind of storylines or this dialogue that keeps coming out. But again, does it play well? Will it win him elections? Not at the moment. He needs to do other things, really. He does need to actually really show some significant social and economic change. Because at the moment it just seems so stagnant in Russia, really, that yes, there are those who become wealthy under Putin, but there are many people who are still waiting for that lottery win.
Dmitry, the nuclear arsenal issue, how statesmanlike is it to brag about your nuclear weapons stockpiles? Could be seen as a little more Kim Jong-il than Barack Obama.
You may compare the rhetoric of Putin with the rhetoric of Medvedev and even Yeltsin. So, you know that we have two foreign politician languages. One politician language is the language of the communication between the leaders, between our president and maybe between Obama. So, and the other political language is the language for the internal for the internal policy, because it seems to be quite acceptable, quite important in order to demonstrate his force, the force of country, and certainly to stress that our force is based not only on the gas and oil trade, but also on the military force. But you know that that point of view seems to be quite weak nowadays, because the majority of Russian people knows that our army has very strong problems nowadays.
Well, it's interesting actually, because the rhetoric hasn't really changed. I mean, I always think of Putin really still following the great Yevgeny Primakov and his foreign policy ideas. That really, he's the problem with Putin is that he does have a lot of experience of, beyond Russia in his previous days in East Germany, but beyond that, not really. He's really lent upon real specialists in foreign policy.
Yeah, I think fundamentally what this boils down to is that unlike in 2003, 4 or 7, 8, there's no real message that Putin can present. In 1999, 2000 campaign, he was the one who was saving Russia and taking it away from the financial crisis. In 2003-4, he was the one who battled the oligarchs, helped fix the economy, fix the insurgency in Chechnya. Now he's coming back and says, well, vote for me because I'm Putin. This is what I've achieved before, but there is nothing else. And what I found really disturbing in this debate was that he talked a lot about social welfare and so on, but he hasn't really tackled any of the fundamental questions Russia faces at the moment. Be it, the sort of the unsustainable pension system, migration, how to develop Far East. None of that was answered.
Yeah, ironically, actually, in the election campaign, Zhirinovsky seemed seems to have been answering all those sort of questions.
Exactly.
Really. United Russia, really, unfortunately, as a political party, doesn't seem to have an agenda. It seems to be vote for us and we'll solve every problem. But it seems that the other political parties, even the Communist Party, seems to actually be working on their manifesto, which is what we do in the UK, for instance.
Jana, one of the Putin comments which I think has made the biggest headlines because it's got an international flavour is his accusation that US special forces have been involved in the killing of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Is that rhetoric, or does he know something we don't know?
Well, I'd like to know what he knows, because I don't know where he knows this from. Obviously, US was one of the main actors of the Libya war, but I have no knowledge whatsoever about their kind of involvement in the death of Gaddafi. I mean, we all know the same facts, which is that it was done by the local people, with the Western support in terms of battling Gaddafi's forces. But I think this is part of the rhetoric that we talked about before.
Well, I mean, definitely in the case of Gaddafi, there was a lot of special forces involvement throughout the conflict. I mean, supporting, of course, all the kind of capabilities with bombing and things like that. You needed specialised SF troops on the ground to actually do the targeting and doing all the specialist things that those sort of people do. But of course, they didn't kill Gaddafi in the end because Gaddafi was just killed by a random person deciding to put a pistol to his head. But of course, to find Gaddafi, I'm sure there was a lot of intelligence-led operations that the Russians probably were aware of as much as most journalists are in the UK.
Dmitry, what did you make of the Gaddafi comment?
So, firstly, I want to mention that the Putin's position toward Gaddafi was quite different from the position of our President Medvedev from the very beginning of the campaign, the military campaign in Libya. Firstly, secondly, I want to stress that the predominant mood of Russian population toward the war in Libya is the negative mood, and I remember the days, on the end of October, when the TV translated the body of killed Gaddafi and the lines of Libyan people who wanted to see the former dictator. So the general attitude toward that situation was negative, not only from the official mass media, but even in internet blogs and from the different people, from the different ranges of our political positions and political parties, even from opposition.
I think Jana wants to come back on this point.
Yeah, just a small one. I think I seen this poll today, but I think what he was also trying to do was appeal to the section of the Russian population which really disapproves the Arab Spring and all the uprisings that were happening. And it's interesting, it's only one of the few countries where majority of people think that Arab Spring hasn't really brought anything good. And I think that was the appeal targeted them.
I mean, definitely, going on to the Arab Spring, that's what we're all talking about for Russia, really, whether an Arab Spring would come to Russia. And in my opinion, really, I would not like an Arab Spring to come to Russia because I can only see a lot of bloodshed. And what I would like to see is an opposition presidential candidate comes forward and all these kind of Facebook Twitties or whatever do actually decide to vote for that person, and there's a peaceful transition of power, not like these coloured revolutions like in Kyrgyzstan where we've seen violence, and it's not nice and it's absolutely horrific. So what we've seen in Libya we don't want to see in Russia.
It's been a wonderful piece of political theatre and drama, and the fact that we've all spent the last 20 or so minutes dissecting each and every one of Putin's comments shows that to some extent it works. Doesn't what we've seen demonstrate that, for better or for worse, there really is nobody else of the status to govern Russia? Dmitry?
No, I think that really we have seen a piece of political theatre, and I want to stress that the new political theatre of the next year will be much more interesting than it was before. And I think that we will see the features of the real, not political competition, because in order to see competition, there will be the real participants of that competition. We will see the Putin attempts to modernize himself. And it will be very interesting, very lucky.
This is what his spokesman has been saying. He's described a Putin Mark II. What do you think that will look like?
a Putin Mark II, probably a bit like the Mark I, but perhaps there's a bit more, maybe he's used his PR people differently, really. It is difficult to say, but it's interesting that he was talking about Kudrin, that he's actually, there seems to be the kind of the fallout is not so big anymore, really, that he might, came up in the Q&A, where he might actually bring him back into the government again, which was very interesting, that they're almost trying to show a united front as such. So it does show something that the concerns about the protests on Saturday really do mean that Putin is listening in a weird way. So.
Final question for all of you, if you'd like to take part in a bit of hypothesizing, but if you could be the one to define Putin Mark II, what would be the first thing you would like to do upon becoming president again?
I think that what any president of Russia should try to do is really stop talking about political theaters and games and focus on the real problems of the country. With Putin Mark II, I'm not sure this is going to happen precisely for the reason we spent 20 minutes of talking about, which is the sort of lack of any initiative and the big trouble that Putin faces because he's realized that the system he's created cannot sustain and go on without him. And I think that's the big problem. I think what he is personally going to focus on is making sure that political system doesn't crumble. And that's a sad news for Russia.
No, it's very interesting actually because the Russia that has been, or the Putinist Russia that's been created, is reliant on a Putin being at the top. Because, I mean, when you do look at Russian politics at the different levels, you see all these little mini Putins going all the way down, that they're very much of the same type, really. And they do owe their position to Vladimir Putin. So it's fascinating on that front.
Dmitry in Moscow?
So Putin has to realize that the main danger for present-day Russia is the international contradictions between the Russian nationalities. And he hasn't to make any mistakes as he made today when he told that we need the more strong rules for the internal Russian migrants. And certainly the Russian inhabitants realize what are those internal migrants. He seemed they're Caucasian people. Certainly it's a great problem, but it will be the real problem which may explore the Russia inside. I mean, and I think that Putin or even other person on the president chair has to realize that problem and don't play any game with the national questions and some other national sharp problems as Putin made today.
That was the political analyst Dmitry Andreev over the phone from Moscow, and I've been joined in the studio by Jana Kobzova, a fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Pirt, an expert on elections. You've been listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm James Reinl. From me and the rest of the team here in St James's Square, goodbye.